here you have this article which says, it's interesting how an Islamic mosque looks like a Pentecostal worship service, hands raised, swaying back and forth, and you're like, okay, times have changed. And but it tells us something really important about how kind of worldviews compete for people, and I think it also should tell us a lot when we do look at how Christian mission and Christian church services have tried to adjust to a more and more secularized West. Worship services today, which feed expressive individualism and treat us as if we're the center of the Bible's narrative. Listen, that has way more to do with Western secularism than it does biblical Christianity. But you know what? A market-driven approach to let's employ market principles, and let's grow this thing at all cost, and let's turn the pastor into a CEO leader and not worry so much about his theological knowledge, but worry more about his his leadership ability. And by the way, while we're at it, let's not worry so much about our worship leaders' theological prowess or orthodoxy or care, and let's see whether he can look a lot like the most popular grunge artist of the day. And this goes back to the 90s, but it tells you when worldviews rub up against each other, then we inherit from each other. And so I think it's an interesting kind of warning and an interesting analysis to say, look, we have to be Christian authentically is to be Christian on our own terms. Now, I'll say one more thing, which I think's really interesting. I remember, it's probably been 15 years. I used to do a pretty frequent segment on KKLA, which is a radio station out in Los Angeles, and I would do kind of once a month or something. I'd go on to talk about what's happening in culture. And I remember one time, kind of finishing my segment and hearing the Frank Pastore, who was the host at the time, say, and now, next segment, stay on board. We're going to talk to a Muslim imam. And I thought, well, that was interesting. So I reached out to Frank, or somehow we talked about it. And he said, yeah, this is an imam here in L.A., and he is making the case that the only way Islam is going to survive, and this is in the heat of the post 9/11 conflict, is that if Islam secularizes. Like, Islam has to secularize or it will be stamped out by the rest of the world. And there were some prominent Muslim voices that were calling for that, including some popular Muslim writers and others saying, we can't have this. In other words, the rest of the world's not going to allow us to stay in the 9th century in the same way that we've been doing this. And maybe this is an example that, at least in some parts of the world, they're right. So, anyway, I thought it was a fascinating article and just a kind of an object lesson about how worldviews interact with one another.
Well, and even as you're speaking, I'm reminded there are so many people that have been telling Christians that that's the only way for survival as well. You have to remain relevant and you need to be more secularized. So, I mean, how would you respond to that? I mean, I think I know how you'd respond, but
no.
I mean, how do we respond? How should Christians respond to that?
I respond, what was that Bob Newhart sketch? Stop it. No, way back. You're too young to remember that. But no, what's interesting is the more that Christianity has secularized, the more it's died. So mainline denominations, where if you go on a Sunday morning and listen to a sermon, it sounds like you're listening to NPR. Those are the empty churches. And the church is led by African pastors in the same sort of quote unquote, at least historic body. And I'm thinking of Anglicanism here. They're the ones that are actually that have stayed strong and have actually increased in numbers. So the temptation to downplay the conflict that Christianity has with godlessness, whether in worldview or in morality, is a fool's bargain.